Ronnie Van Zant wore Neil Young t-shirts on stage. He called him an inspiration.
What could drive a loyal fan to pick up a pen and publicly attack his own idol? It boils down to pure pride, a strong sense of identity, and defending a region. Applause. Two hit songs that changed music forever. Starting from the born January 15th, 1948 in Jacksonville, Florida. Ronnie Van. It was a gritty working-class neighborhood where fistfights and street scuffles were just a normal. Being tough wasn't a choice. It was pure survival. Luckily, Ronnie came from a family that knew exactly what that meant. His father, he believed his boys needed to know how to handle themselves, so he started teaching Ronnie to box when he... Lacey later remembered that Ronnie was incredibly bright, but he had a seriously short fuse. If things didn't go his way, he reacted instantly and with intense passion. Instead of trying to crush that fiery spirit, Lacey showed him how to channel it. That mix of discipline and aggression became a core part of Ronnie. It also explains Ali wasn't just a world-class fighter, he was bold, fearless, and impossible to ignore. Ronnie respected those qualities. But before music took over, another dream kept. Ronnie was talented, like really talented. He played American Legion ball and showed real promise. He later claimed the next step could have been AA baseball. He had one of the best batting averages. For a while, it seemed like the baseball diamond was his future. Thankfully, for music lovers everywhere, fate had much bigger plans. As a boy, Ronnie often rode along on his father's trucking routes, glued to the radio. Those long, endless drives exposed him to endless songs and artists. Music wasn't just fun, it became an absolute obsession. Before he ever, according to his mother, Marion, Ronnie and his siblings loved messing around with instruments, but their favorite place to belt out to. Even back then, he wasn't afraid to make some noise. Sadly, his audience didn't always. On his very first day of school, Ronnie couldn't help but sing popular radio hits right in the middle. While the other kids tried to focus on their work, he kept right on with his own one-man. The disruption caused such a scene that he got in trouble, forcing his mother to come down and talk to. Even as a young boy, there was no way to shut that music off. It was just a part of who he was. By age 16, Ronnie already showed another trait that would define his life naturally. He put together his first group, appropriately named Us, and naturally took the lead singer spot. Most teenagers would have just moved on. Ronnie saw it as the perfect excuse to. Soon enough, he teamed up with Bob Burns, Gary Rossington, Alan Collins, and Larry Johnstrom to form a new band called My Backyard. Some of these guys, what they lacked in years of experience, they made up for with pure drive. When they weren't in school, and plenty of times when they really should have been, they were complete. Eventually, My Backyard evolved into a new outfit called the Noble Five. They started booking gigs at local dances, usually making just enough cash to cover gas. Still, every single show sharpened their playing and tightened their chemistry. Not everyone enjoyed the racket, though. Practice sessions bounced from one parent's garage to the next. As the young rockers, Ronnie's booming voice carried across the whole neighborhood, and before long, annoyed neighbors started filing formal complaints. Gary Rossington recalled, most bands would have taken the hint and quit. This group just found somewhere else to plug in. With help from Ronnie's dad, they moved their gear to an abandoned house on a farm just outside. The place was cramped, old, and stifling, but to the band, it was perfect. They called it. Inside that weathered shack, Ronnie pushed a bunch of rowdy teenagers into becoming sharp every single morning. Long before most folks woke up, he would pull up in his beat-up 1955 Chevy truck. They hit the local donut shop where his mom worked for coffee, then headed to rehearse. Sessions stretched 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours straight. Weekends vanished. Days and sometimes they did not make it home until the following morning. Far from quiet suburban life, Hell House served as their boot camp. The five, they were crafting something truly special. The only snag was that they still had not figured out who they really were. Throughout those early years, Ronnie Van Zant and his crew were constantly searching for something. Surprisingly, it was not their sound they struggled to find. It was their actual identity. They kept booking gigs around Jacksonville, but every show featured a different name. Next, they were the Sons of Satan. Then came names like Conqueror Worm, The Pretty Ones, and these musicians were testing every possible image, desperately trying to discover their true self. The answer finally showed up in the most unlikely way possible. Through a long-running feud with a high school gym teacher. When not rehearsing for hours at Hellhouse Van Zant, and his pals were busy testing, all future Lynyrd Skynyrd members attended that school except for Alan Collins. And none of them cared much for the strict dress code. The rules were suffocating. Hair could not touch the collar. Sideburns had to stay short. Shirts stayed tucked, and socks were always required. For teens obsessed with rock and roll, those rules felt complete. Van Zant came up with a creative fix. Before school, he would coat his hair in Vaseline and slick it back just enough to look shorter. That gym coach, however, was not fooled. After gym class, students had to shower, and the water washed the Vaseline away, suddenly, time and time again. The coach caught Van Zant and his friends breaking the rules, sending them to the principal, often result. Eventually, guitarist Gary Rossington hit his breaking point. Fed up with the constant lectures and discipline, he rebelled and walked away from school for a few nights later. While playing at a spot called the Forest Inn, Van Zant had a bright idea. Back then, the band still went by the name 1%. Looking out, they all knew that strict gym teacher who made life miserable for the aspiring rockers. On a total whim, Van Zant suggested renaming the band to a funny, mocking variation of the crowd roared with laughter and cheers. The reaction was instant, just like that, with a name that finally stuck and a sound gaining real power every month. The group quickly became a staple around Jacksonville. Their schedule was absolutely... They often played one venue for kids until midnight, then kept on performing at adult clubs. And nights were long, and the pay was slim, but they were building a reputation. In the mid-60s, he met Nadine Insko, and they got married in January 1960. Soon after, they welcomed a baby girl named Tammy. For a split second, it looked like Van Zant might actually give up his rock and roll dreams. He grabbed a steady job at his brother-in-law's auto parts shop and apparently grew so skilled, but stability just never stuck for him. The marriage ended in 1969. Their romance moved forward incredibly fast. A few years later, they married and welcomed their daughter Melody. Meanwhile, by 1970, the band cut a demo tape hot enough to catch the eye of Capricorn Records. To everyone's shock, Van Zant turned them down cold. Instead of grabbing the first payday, the guys spent 3 years busting their tails in rave bars. They took any gig that would have them, constantly refining their sound and sharpening that stage persona. Gear got better, the songwriting hit a new level, and their live shows became tighter and more powerful. That signature southern rock sound was finally emerging. Funny enough, Van Zant never... While he knew their lyrics captured the heart of southern life, he always insisted their style was just as much about British rock groups as any American. In his mind, Lynyrd Skynyrd owed as much to bands like Free as to their own. Whatever people called the music, the massive effort was finally paying off. In 1973, MCA Records came calling with a much sweeter deal. That call changed the game. Soon after the band dropped their debut album, pronounced the record introduced hits that became absolute rock classics like Tuesday's Gone, Simple Man, and honestly, nobody could have predicted the legacy Freebird would build. During their concerts, Van Zant often polled the crowd to see what they wanted to hear. The answer was always the same. As fans roared for Freebird, the guys would launch into... That song became way more than a hit. It was a massive cultural phenomenon. Years later, fans at shows for completely different artists still scream for Freebird to... Right in the middle of it all stood Van Zant playing barefoot, totally in his element in front of thousands of people. But behind the glory, Van Zant had a legendary explosive temper. Tales of brawls, ugly run-ins, and wild behavior followed the band. Another disaster ended with Van Zant and Gary Rossington getting badly beaten up after the bruising was so bad that Van Zant had to start wearing sunglasses on stage to hide the damage. Ironically, the shades just added to his growing mysterious reputation. That same intensity ran through the band too. He demanded total focus and if he thought someone was slacking off during a show, he made sure they heard about it immediately. His leadership was definitely tough, but it turned Lynyrd Skynyrd into one of the sharpest. By the mid-70s, the band was known for their wild living, heavy drinking, and frequent brutal. That chaotic, rowdy backstage behavior just became part of the myth. Instead of downplaying those stories, the people around them fueled the fire, thinking it built. By 1976, Van Zant had already racked up several arrests, and the friction in the band was spiking. Friends described him as a guy who could be incredible. Despite all that inner turmoil, their fame just kept climbing. After the debut, Lynyrd Skynyrd pumped out a string of massive records and hits, yet even with their star rising, dark warning signs were flashing everywhere. That same year, both Allen Collins and Gary Rossington were in horrific car crashes. Rossington's wreck was particularly brutal, totaling the car and forcing them to act some show. While he was glad his boys survived, he felt their reckless stupidity was gambling away. Looking to send a serious message, he slapped them both with fines and poured that anger in. That track turned into That Smell. The lyrics were a blunt warning about the dangers of addiction. Van Zant prayed that song would finally wake his bandmates up before everything fell apart. Looking back now, it feels like a haunting, sad, cautionary tale. Soon those haunting words would take on a far darker, more sinister meaning than anyone could. Back in 1995, Lacey Van Zant shared a chilling memory about his son Ron. Relaxing in his favorite recliner, he reflected on a strange quality that truly said, in his father's eyes, Ronnie possessed what folks used to call second sight. Ronnie spent years telling those closest to him that he would never live to see his 30th birthday. The unsettling thing was that he didn't just mention it once. He repeated that Lynyrd Skynyrd drummer Artemus Pyle recalled one night in Tokyo when the band, out of the blue, Ronnie calmly told him that he wasn't going to make it to 30. Pyle brushed it off immediately, certain it was just drunken talk. But Ronnie stayed dead. He insisted that when his time finally came, he wanted to die with his boots on. The band's sound man, who would eventually produce legendary acts like Journey and Night Rain, remembered Ronnie making similar comments countless times. Elson felt that Ronnie attacked every single day at full throttle, burning incredibly bright, and constant. To the people around him, it was a haunting reminder of other famous rock icons who had died. Even more disturbing, Ronnie wasn't the only one carrying a heavy sense of dread. Assistant road manager Dean Kilpatrick reportedly voiced similar feelings. At first, people grew tired of hearing these predictions. It became one of those things But as 1977 unfolded and Ronnie's 30th birthday drew danger, his warnings became impossible to ignore. Then October arrived. On October 17, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd released a street. The original album cover featured the band standing on a city street surrounded by flames. On October 20th, Ronnie Van Zant and his bandmates boarded a Convair C. Even before they took off, serious concerns surrounded the aging aircraft. Kevin Elson later admitted there had been previous issues with the plane. Mechanics checked. Looking back, Elson would later say that all the warning signs had been staring them right in the face. There had been several other bizarre, strange moments in the months leading up to that final flight. Backup singer JoJo Billingsley noticed that Ronnie had started calling himself. At the time, the nickname made little sense. Tragically, Mississippi would become forever tied. The aircraft itself was a major red flag. The Convair 240 was built in 19... Earlier that same year, members of Aerosmith's crew reportedly refused to... Cassie Gaines was among the group who felt hesitant to board. Still, Ronnie pushed everyone to get on. With a mix of humor and fatalism, soon Ronnie Van Zant, Allen Collins, Steve Gaines, Cassie Gaines, Gary Rossington, Billy Powell, and Leon Wilkson, plus Artemus Pyle, Leslie Hawkins, and the rest of the crew, finally settled into their seat. At 4:02 p.m., the plane departed Greenville, South Carolina, headed for... Pilot Walter McCreary filed the flight plan, checked the weather, told controllers the plane... Then roughly 2.5 hours into the flight, everything changed in an instant. McCreary contacted Houston Air Traffic Control with some truly alarming news. Controllers immediately cleared the flight to divert toward Macomb Airport in the state of Mississippi. Even then, the pilot tried to avoid declaring a full emergency, asking only for the most... The aircraft had officially run out of fuel. Houston requested urgent confirmation. The pilot's response sounded confused and strained. Then there was only silence. Inside the cabin, most of the passengers had absolutely no idea how great. Keyboardist Billy Powell later recalled that people were just relaxing playing cards. Artemis Pyle, having some flight experience, started shouting instructions on how to brace. Ronnie Van Zant walked over to Pyle and grabbed his hand. It was a simple, silent. Despite the sheer terror, survivors later recalled a strange, eerie calm settled. Rather than giving in to panic, many people just prayed quietly while waiting for the end. For nearly 10 agonizing minutes, the powerless plane glided through the sky. Billy Powell later described the horrific sensation of the plane shearing through the treetops. It was violent and relentless, like the aircraft was being tossed and hammered from every. Massive pine trees, standing nearly 80 feet tall, ripped into the metal fuselage as, according to the official crash report, the plane plowed hundreds of feet into the woods before the cockpit slammed directly into a massive tree, killing pilots, Walter McCreary and the fuselage split open. Chaos erupted inside. Seats ripped from the roof of the plane peeled back, throwing people and luggage deep into the surrounding. Eventually, the twisted wreckage ground to a halt in a dark, swampy stretch of forest. Billy Powell managed to crawl out of the wreckage. Looking around, he realized the plane had been. Only then did he start to notice his own injuries. His nose was severely mangled, and blood was streaming all over his face. Shocked, he sat on the wreckage, weeping until cries for help shattered the silence. Others were screaming in agony. Powell immediately started doing what he could to help. He wrapped a torn shirt around his wounds and joined Artemis Pyle and road crew member. Pyle himself was badly hurt. The crash force had knocked off his shoes, leaving his socks. Despite the pain, the men pushed through the thick, jagged brush until they finally found the farm. Mode had heard the thunderous crash from his home. Seeing bloodied strangers emerging from the woods, he initially feared they were escaped convicts, but once he realized what had happened, his focus shifted entirely towards saving the survivors. By the time rescue teams finally reached the scene, 6 people had tragically lost their pilots, Walter McCreary and William Gray, road manager Dean. He was just 87 days from his 30th birthday. Ronnie Van Zant famously hated. When you look at the larger-than-life figures who have defined rock and roll history, few feuds are as legendary or as deeply misunderstood as the clash between Lynyrd. The reality is that it is almost impossible to overstate just how much both of the Lynyrd Skynyrd took the gritty soul of the American South and turned it into some bluesy grit and hard rock into a sound that felt both rebellious and. Tracks like Freebird, Give Me 3 Steps, and That Smell did not just become hits. They became massive anthems. Meanwhile, Neil Young was building his own incredible as part of the legendary Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, or during his acclaimed solo. Young earned a reputation as a rock icon. Even decades later, he keeps recording, and that commitment to speaking openly is precisely what sparked one of rock history's most. Neil Young has never been shy about his views on politics or social justice. His worldview was shaped by his Canadian roots and a more liberal outlook. Looking at especially the American South, he often viewed many local traditions and political stances. That perspective inevitably began to bleed into his songwriting. Ironically, before any of the controversy began, Ronnie Van Zant was actually one of the Lynyrd Skynyrd lead singer, openly praised Young's music and frequently wore Neil Young shirts. He respected Young as a songwriter. To Ronnie, Young was not just another guy in the industry. That genuine admiration made what happened next feel deeply, painfully personal. Back in 1970, Neil Young dropped Southern Man on his iconic. The track took aim at Southern racism, highlighting heavy topics like slavery, and tons of people hailed the track for its bold, honest message. Others, especially down south, felt attacked. For Ronnie Van Zant and countless others, they felt Young reduced millions of real people to harmful stereotypes, condemning the entire region for the sins of a few. As the heat grew, Young claimed his lyrics were meant to support the civil rights movement, but for many the damage felt permanent. Then came round 2. Although he later claimed the track was more personal than political, and that the state was just a symbol, not a target, many listeners couldn't tell the difference. For those already fuming over Southern Man, Alabama, felt like a direct punch to their way of life. From his point of view, Young had absolutely crossed the line trying to make a point. While Van Zant had zero time for racism, he felt Young unfairly shamed an entire He saw a massive gap between calling out the South's flaws and dismissing the people living. Rather than just barking back through interviews, Van Zant took the musician's route. He wrote a comeback track. That anthem was Sweet Home. The hit celebrated Southern pride while pushing back against what the guys in Skynyrd saw as right in the middle sat one of the most legendary lines in rock history. Directly calling out Neil Young to make sure everyone knew Lynyrd Skynyrd heard every word, the hit defined the band's career. But the aftermath of this drama is the truly... Instead of letting the bad blood fester, Neil Young eventually started rethinking his own stand. Over time, he admitted the lyrics in Alabama didn't come across as clearly. Looking back, he owned up to the fact that the song sounded condescending and accusatory. It was a rare, humble moment from a huge rock star. Even Wilder Young actually grew to love Sweet Home Alabama instead of hating it. He started praising the track, and the band recognizing the raw passion and sincerity behind. Far from holding a grudge, he respected that Lynyrd Skynyrd stood their ground for what. Years later, he even joked that having his name immortalized in such a massive rock anthem wasn't. Young even performed Sweet Home Alabama live, treating the whole famous feud with a sense of humor. By then, both sides had finally found some common ground. In a shocking move toward peace, Young sent the band a demo of Powderfinger, hoping it could have kicked off a whole new era between the former rivals, but fate had other plans. In October 1977, tragedy hit when Ronnie Van Zant and the guys never got the chance to record Powderfinger. That track later became one of Neil Young's most legendary songs. But fans still wonder what it would have sounded like with Ronnie Van Zant's grit. During the show, he mashed up Alabama with Sweet Home Alabama, honoring the very men who had called him. It is one of rock and roll's greatest ironies. What started as a messy fight over politics underneath the headlines and the famous verses, there was real mutual respect between two artists who cared about their beliefs, and in the end, Ronnie Van Zant and Neil Young didn't let a feud define their legacy. They buried the hatchet long before tragedy changed everything.